Good evening and welcome. I'm Mike Stevens and I'm the president of the Ballaarat Mechanics Institute. Before we get going, I would like to acknowledge the land on which we stand as land of First Nations people. I acknowledge the Wadawurrung People of the Kulin Nation and recognise their connection to the land, waterways and culture. I pay my respect to elders past, present and emerging. And I welcome you all to this evening's session on everything that you wanted to know about council and are too afraid to ask. This is the first in a series of 4 sessions that we'll be running. This one tonight generally about councils and how they work, and then the following 3 that Phil Roberts will talk to you about at the conclusion of tonight will be run with candidates who agree to be present, to be interviewed and tell us why we should elect them. Right now, it's my pleasure to hand over to our very own board member, Prue Bentley. You might think she works for the ABC, but I welcome you, Prue, and ask you to introduce the speakers and get the show on the road.
Well, thank you very much for that, Mike. Good evening and welcome to the forum. We've got a marvellous panel of guests this evening, and they have bucket loads of experience in the world of local government from all sides. And hopefully we're going to peel back the curtain to discover how these organisations that affect all of our lives in one way or another work. And one of the reasons that we at the BMI wanted to hold this event and the upcoming series that Mike just mentioned was that we felt that there was a lot of energy building in the community to engage with the functions, the politics and the decisions of local government. You don't have to look very far to find councils, both large and small, who've been in strife. But when local government is working effectively, it's efficient, it's visionary, and it directly improves the lives of its citizens. If you are considering standing for council, tonight's event is for you. If you want to know a bit more about how councils function, we'll get to that as well. And if you try to find out who to vote for, you may want to come back in subsequent weeks when we meet some of the local candidates, but you will get something out of tonight. We're going to be hearing from each of our guests in turn first. Judy Verlin, who is a 4-time Mayor of Ballarat, Janet Dore, the current interim CEO of the City of Ballarat, and Kathryn Arndt, the CEO of the Victorian Local Governance Association. And I encourage you to pop your questions in the chat space on YouTube. I can include them at the end. We're going to have a big group discussion and you can be a part of that as well with your questions. So first up, let's start with standing for council and the role of a councillor. Judy Verlin is a former Ballarat Mayor. In fact, she enjoyed it so much, she held the position 4 times. Judy's here to talk about the role of the councillor, what makes an effective representative and what it really is like to take on the job. Thanks, Judy.
Thanks, Prue, and thanks for the opportunity to have a chat. I think it's really important, these sort of forums, because whilst there is formal training available, really, councillors or once you get elected, you really just have to learn on your feet, learn in the chamber, and it can be quite scary to start with. But, you know, you just have to make sure that you remain true to yourself, true to your own values, and that people will respect you for that. I like to think of the councillor as being the conduit between the community and the organisation. So your role is to try and find some sense in the middle of sometimes quite, you know, passionate issues that people are concerned about. And that's one of the problems. Often people don't get interested in local government until it's something affecting them in their backyard. And so by then they're usually frustrated and they feel by the time they hit their councillor, they can actually be quite annoyed about where they're at. So I think the role of a councillor is very much about the ability to listen, to be genuinely be seen to listen, to take on board the issues, and then to be well informed, to actually work with the organisation to find out exactly all of the information that you need to be able to base your decisions on. When you go into council, sometimes you think that it might only be just the meetings, whereas there's lots of meetings. There's the formal statutory meetings, but there's also, all of the other committee meetings and things that's required. And you have to be able to read. You read mountains of information and to be able to siphon that through and decipher what is actually, the important points. In the chamber, you'll be, quickly found out if you aren't well informed. And it's the right of the people who have elected you to make sure that you know what's going on. And the only way to do that is, I found, was to actually go out and visit and speak to people, look at the planning applications that are in front of you, and to make sure that you know all of the issues that are around it. The organisation, the professionals, have an opinion about how something should happen. The community can have a totally different opinion. Once you're elected, you are elected by your ward and a group of people. But once you're elected, you're expected to represent the whole of the municipality. And that can be quite challenging at times if you think, that something should be happening in your area, but that really your ward is doing quite well compared to a different ward. The issue around actually making sure you have good, diverse representation across the whole municipality can be quite challenging. You have to have broad shoulders. You need to be able to take a fair bit of flack and to be able to make sure that, as I said at the start, true to your values, that you think to yourself, well, I'm doing this to the best of my ability. I'm doing this representing the community who know me, and I have to have confidence in the role that I have been asked to play. I think you shouldn't be paralysed by negative social media. That can actually sort of define you as a person if you're not careful. And so that can be very difficult for you to be able to work through. I had 10 years in local government, and I think it's an absolute privilege to be appointed by the community to be able to represent their interests. And it is an enormous responsibility, but it's an absolute privilege and honour to be able to do that. And you've got to balance up the good and the bad, and there will be a bit of both. I don't think there's any point in going into council as a single issue councillor. You can't go out and promise the world that I'm going to change this and I'm going to do that, because you are one of 9. And you need to be able to work with your fellow councillors to be able to convince them that of the issues that are in your community and your ward. And that's why this issue about whether they should have 3 in one ward or whether they should be single council wards is a difficult debate, because sometimes you can be a bit of a lone ranger in some of the issues that you think are important from your point of view. As a councillor, you need to be able to look at the big picture and not get drawn down into the everyday workings. And I have an absolute understanding between the role of the board, the role of the directors, the role of the council compared to the organisation, who are there to deliver on the aspirations of the council. So very quickly into your term, you'll be asked to build a council plan, a 4-year council plan. And that is a difficult one, because you've got 9 individual personalities. They're going to have to come together in a room and actually be able to work out what do we want to achieve in the 4 years, because it goes just like that. It goes really quickly. And all of the buzzwords around good governance, conflict of interest, the advocacy, understanding the Local Government Act, compliance, finance and risk, they are real. They are the core responsibilities of what you are expected to do. And it is your absolute responsibility to understand what your role is and to be able to enjoy it. Then get to the stage where you say, I'm actually having a good time here. And people will respect you if you are firm, consistent in your decision making, and that they can understand why you're taking the position that you're taking. That doesn't mean to say you take the popular role. That means you are actually supposed to take the role or the decision that is what's best for the whole of the municipality. And as I say, think big. Ballarat now, as a major regional city in Victoria, has a big role to play in the Victorian economy. So roads, rates and rubbish are absolutely fundamental to what should happen at council. But if I actually had someone say, I'm standing on roads, rates and rubbish, I would say, you're not for me. Because if there's an issue with those three things, that's either a policy issue or a resourcing issue. One that you should be able to get the organisation to actually speak to them and say, what's going wrong here? But if you're actually a small single issue councillor, the city of Ballarat's too big for that. It's too important, the role we play in the regional landscape, but also in the Victorian and the Australian landscape. And so it is a huge responsibility, and it is a large budget and a lot of information to get your head around, but it's a fantastic opportunity.
Judy, we will pick up some of those issues when we have our discussion. You've really touched on, I know that it's a big issue, and there's a lot to learn about becoming a councillor, and that really is only very much the bare bones, but there's quite a few things in there I'd like to follow up with you at the end when we have our discussion. But let's now turn to the other side of the equation, which is the council organisation. Janet Dore is also with us. She is the CEO of Ballarat City Council, and she's going to be talking a bit more about the difference between the council and the organisation of local government. How do they complement each other, and how do they work together well? So Janet, welcome.
Thank you, Prue, and thank you, Judy. Judy was my mayor just after amalgamations, and we made a pretty awesome team, I think. But I'm always in awe of what Judy says about the role of a councillor, and I couldn't agree more. But the role of the chief executive is very specific as well, and it's prescribed in a particular part of the Local Government Act, and that Local Government Act has now changed. There was a new legislation this year in 2020, and that's being gradually implemented. Now, the kind of duties that the chief executive has is supporting the mayor and councillors, ensuring the efficient and effective management of the operations day to day of the council, ensuring that council decisions are implemented, and giving advice. I believe, this is not in the Act, but you have to give advice to the council that's realistic, that is clearly stated, given options for councillors to make decisions, and to absolutely disclose all the information that's relevant. Many of you will be aware that we had an Ombudsman's report about this council, and my role is really to implement a lot of the recommendations from that report. So I have had to do some things that perhaps may not be popular, but the main thing is to restore the confidence in the community through the actions of the organisation and our work with the council. There's specific things about the employment of the Chief Executive Officer, and it's the only officer that the council itself appoints. There are no other staffing matters that the council gets involved in. They hold the Chief Executive Officer accountable for everything. The implementation of the council plan, workforce planning, making sure there's enough resources, compliance and good governance, and many of the Ombudsman's recommendations and issues raised were about governance, and they were about things like taking shortcuts and not going through proper process and those sorts of things. So it's easy to see how things can go off the rails if you don't pay attention to some of those detailed things. So we've reviewed and revised that the procurement policy, and we have a section on governance to ensure that we do get things right. We are set a budget and an annual plan, which is based on the 4-year council plan, and quite often longer term plans, 10-year plans, for instance, a 10-year financial plan. The CEO can appoint the numbers of staff and develop the structure of the organisation as they see fit to produce the services and activities that are required under the plan. The biggest thing about being a CEO in local government, in my experience, has been always the relationship between the CEO and the mayor. If that doesn't work well, or if something is skewed about it, because as I saw in a couple of occasions in New South Wales, mayors can be involved with things like developers and campaign donations that are not good. And you've got to be able to advise councillors on those sorts of things and stress the importance of sticking to a code of conduct that they have to sign up to when they're first elected. These matters are very important because the way the council behaves affects how the organisation responds and feels. And in the past, in Ballarat, the way councils have conducted themselves has resulted in a lowering of confidence within the organisation because people are afraid and bad news is not welcomed. It all depends on the CEO and their integrity for mine, and getting a good team around them to make sure that behaviour is modelled properly, that bad behaviour is called out and dealt with, and that we don't walk past bad behaviour, as David Morrison said some years ago when he woke up to the effect on many women in the military forces. The principles of the new Act are quite fantastic because they focus very clearly and strategically on transparency, governance, service, and a few other things, but it is a principle-based act, and it clearly distinguishes the role of the CEO in running the organisation and the role of the council in coming to decisions that are in line with their priorities, which are guided by that 4-year council plan. Quite
Janet,
often,
I might jump in there so that we can move on, but I do want to come back to that Local Government Act because there's quite a lot in there. Can we move now to Kathryn? Thank you, Janet. We'll come back to you in just a minute. It's now time to talk to Kathryn Arndt, who is the CEO of the VLGA, the Victorian Local Governance Association. And as you heard from both Judy and Janet, governance is one of those terms that you hear a lot in this field. But I think sometimes we don't always understand what it exactly means. So let's throw to Kathryn now, who can give us a bit more information about that and also what the VLGA does from that sort of broad spectrum level. Thanks, Kathryn.
Thank you, Prue. And also I'd like to thank Mike and Phil from the BMI for the opportunity to talk with you tonight. And wow, it's a hard task to follow Judy and Janet. And of course, I think we could have listened to them talk for a lot longer, and certainly Janet going into the very distinct and documented legislated responsibilities of the CEO is probably warrants a 3-hour conversation at least. It's my great pleasure to be joining you today, and as Prue said, I'm from the VLGA, the Victorian Local Governance Association. We're an independent governance body, a peak body for local government in Victoria, and our role is predominantly to support good governance at that local level. So supporting candidates and also councillors in their role as councillors who have very distinct legislated governance responsibilities. And I think what really strikes me, and certainly from my observation, is exactly what Judy referred to, and that was, I guess, that sense that local government was about and limited to roads, rates and rubbish. A lot of voters actually don't understand that local government is a $9 billion sector in Victoria. It employs approximately 44,500 staff. There are 638 elected representatives across Victoria. And it's a $9 billion sector, as I said, which delivers over 100 different services to local communities. So well beyond just roads, rates and rubbish. And what that means from a governance perspective, which is essentially what the role of the council is. And exactly as Judy said, councillors who do come into the council chamber with a single issue will very quickly discover that their role is much broader than that single issue, which in fact they may need to leave at the door outside of the chamber before they come in. The role of the councillor at that governance level is to really understand and have an open mind about the matters that are before them for discussion, deliberation and decision making. So they really need to understand and read the officers' reports that will be presented to them, often in 400, 500 page meeting papers, and come into that decision-making process with a very open mind. They need to be inquisitive, they need to ask questions, and they really need to also listen to the advice that is being presented to them by the CEO, which has been informed through, again, very rigorous research from the officers that support the CEO in their role. The CEO has a very important job, and that is to manage essentially what's a multi-million-dollar business and manage hundreds, if not thousands, of staff in that process. And certainly for a council the size of Ballarat, that would be the case. Perhaps the smallest regional council in Victoria would have a turnover of about $25 to $30 million, whereas some of the larger ones are closer to $400 million. So these are not insignificant businesses. The role of a councillor is so important, and it has very unique responsibilities that are legislated for under the Local Government Act, as Janet also indicated. And this is unlike, in fact, other levels of government. Local government is quite unique. And one thing I think from the VLGA's perspective is that we're really keen to increase the awareness of the community in participating and exercising their votes in local government, and also ensure that those people who are looking to run for election really understand those responsibilities. But I'm very happy to have a conversation with Judy and Janet about how that might play out in practice. And as I said, it's been my great pleasure to join you today.
Thank you very much, Kathryn. I'm going to bring everybody back in so that we can have a good all-in discussion. So Judy, Verlin, Janet, Dore, and of course, Kathryn, Arndt from VLGA. There's so much in this. There's such a lot going on, and we're talking about everything from processes to politics. And I did want to start actually, and in fact, if you're watching this and you've got some questions for any of our guests tonight, now is the time to pop them in the chat function. Our whiz kid, who is behind the scenes, Sam, will be feeding those questions through to us during this part of the discussion. So please don't be shy. If you've got a good question, please let us know. I do want to start with politics though, and this is actually from a question that came in from somebody who registered when they registered. Now, we have seen increased political party endorsement in these council elections. It has happened in the past, but I think this is the first election I personally have seen the sort of level of political party endorsement that we're seeing now. And people seem quite split on whether the parties have a place in local government. I want to start with you, Judy. What effects do you think this has, and do you think that this is a good thing or a bad thing?
I actually don't agree with it, Prue. I was in a situation where Karen Overington was a pre-selected candidate. I was a pre-selected candidate for 2 different parties, and I was mayor at the time, and politics never entered the chamber. We had the greatest respect for each other. The fact that local government is the opportunity to make the decisions that are best for your community without fear or favour. And I am fearful that if a political party does back a candidate, there will be an expectation they will toe the line. And if you're actually dealing with something that's of significance around waste management or whatever it is for the city of Ballarat, we need to actually find out the issues that are unique, individual to our city and debate them. And so I actually have the greatest respect for politics. I'm heavily involved in politics, but it shouldn't be in the chamber.
It is interesting, isn't it? Because often I find that the local government issues often don't always align with some of the ideals and aspirations of the political parties at the state and federal level. I mean, they do in some cases, but sometimes they don't, and that must be quite hard for those councillors who are affiliated. Janet, do you have an opinion on this?
Oh yes. I've seen the best and the worst of politics in councils. I worked at St Kilda before amalgamations, and I saw a group of councillors that were quite split on their views, but they had delegated committees and which made recommendations to council, had good governance, and they worked together for the best outcome for the whole of the municipality. That is their duty. But too often you see this ward-based old parish pump type politics, which sometimes is influenced by party politics. And they're just not carrying out their duty as they should, because they might be elected by a ward, and by the way, we'll go next election will be no wards, to emphasise that it is the whole of the municipality that they have to consider, that they have to be strategic, and they should not get involved in operational matters. Politics is better off out of the chamber. I was at Newcastle City Council, where I had a third Greens, a third Labor and a third Independent, with a directly elected Lord Mayor, and it's probably one of the worst situations I've ever been in. They were fighting across the groups, within the groups. There was no cohesion and no will to work together. That is the worst of local government. The best of local government was when Judy was mayor. It was just after amalgamation. We had people with different political persuasions, but it didn't enter the chamber. They were working together. It was fantastic.
Are you seeing this, Kathryn, from a sort of statewide perspective? Are you seeing this more and more too?
Look, I agree with both Judy and Janet. Politics shouldn't come into the chamber, or certainly whether it be a political agenda or a single issue, which may, they're sort of similar in a way. And I think, as I said earlier, local government is quite unique because you've got this system that requires the councillors to govern an organisation for a community that is not partisan. As Janet said, communities are made up of diverse groups, and therefore the councillors need to make decisions that represent and ensure the broadest possible reach of the stakeholders in their municipality, and not just one part of that municipality. And of course, we've seen in Victoria that blocks on councils have caused dysfunction. We've had councils who are currently under the control of administrators for related reasons. And I think if you're a candidate considering running for local government, you really need to be clear about that. So even if you are an endorsed candidate, terrific, that might perhaps give you some support or extra support to help you with your campaign. But once you get into the room, in fact, that party's ideology needs to stay out of the room when it comes to your decision making.
We've got a great question from Gaynor, which is a really practical one. How many meetings per month are councillors expected to attend, and which of those is mandatory? Janet, you're having been, right there at the coalface right at this minute. How many meetings are they attending?
Well, it's 1 or 2 a week of formal meetings, which are council or briefing meetings. There are a raft of other community committees that have to have councillor representation on. There are peak body involvements like the Municipal Association Victoria. You might become a delegate to that. Frankly, it can be very busy. And then there's your community that you might want to report back to and get the flow of information going, and making sure that you're advocating for their priorities. But I'll reinforce again, once you take on that responsibility, you have a duty under the Local Government Act to do the right things around that council table, govern for the whole, not get involved in detail.
And Daniel's asking what age you have to be to run for council.
Well, I think you just have to be a legit adult, don't you?
Well, I suspect it's probably over 18, but you don't see a lot of younger people running for council. And I do want to come back to diversity on council, because I know that this is something that, all levels of government and all organisations are trying to address at the moment. But Steve has also asked this question, which is terrific. If I'm aspiring to run for council in the 2024 election, what would you suggest I do between now and then to enhance these aspirations and goals? What a great question. Janet, do you want to start with that one?
Thanks, Prue. I'd really encourage you to watch council meetings or attend council meetings. That's the first step. Watch the website of the peak bodies like VLGA, like the Municipal Association of Victoria, and the local government office. There's a mine of information. Approach somebody who is a councillor or even a retired councillor. I'd recommend Judy to give you some advice, but Judy doesn't have much time because so many people ask her for advice. And I'm happy to steer you in. You can certainly contact me through the council office. We can provide information. Almost everything's online now, so welcome your attendance and good luck.
And with that in mind, you've got Judy for a few more minutes. Steve, Judy, how would you address Steve's question?
Yeah, I think, I started out saying that while there's official training, you actually learn on your feet in the chamber. So I think watching the council in action, so that you understand the meeting procedure, the structure, how you debate, when you speak, when you introduce an item and whatever. That's the actual, if you can actually, I found that I could actually use meeting procedure to my benefit. When you actually don't listen to that, Janet. I think that's critically important. So watching the council in action is very important, but also going online and reading the agendas to understand the diversity of information that's going to come across your desk. You're going to go from, you know, dogs off leashes on parks to waste management to childcare to, you know, there's the diversity of what you have to get your head around is just incredible. So reading a few agendas and trying to understand what the projects and the issues are bubbling along, because they usually last for a couple of years anyway.
And Kathryn, from your perspective, with that broader perspective, because you are looking at large and small councils, aren't you?
Absolutely.
So the trajectory for people joining councils, depending on where they are in the state, would be different, wouldn't it?
Look, absolutely. And in fact, I had a member of the community in a small rural regional area make contact recently, and they wanted to know how they could find out if the current group of councillors were restanding. And the reason they were asking that question was that there was a sense in that community that if the current group of councillors were restanding in the upcoming election, that the community wouldn't put any, or potential candidates in the community wouldn't consider running because they had this sense that, oh, well, you know, we don't want to if John's running again or Mary's running again. Now, that's all well and good. However, what that does create is a risk potentially that there isn't going to be some turnover in the governing body of that local community. And of course, turnover is a principle of good governance. And it's really important that there is diversity around the decision-making table.
Why is turnover such a good thing? What does it do?
Well, it brings in new ways of thinking. It certainly can bring in more diverse points of view. The VLGA runs a number of programs to encourage diversity in local government, and we focus a lot of our programs on the more underrepresented groups. So, for example, women make up about 38% of the total councillor population. Now, women make up over about 51% of the community, and yet they're underrepresented in those elected representative roles. Similarly, young people, as you mentioned, and people from multicultural backgrounds, and also our First Nations people. I think we have one Aboriginal Victorian who is a councillor at the moment, which is, you know, grossly underrepresentative of that community. So participation in local democracy is really important. But for people who are looking at running in the 2024 election, as Janet and Judy said, read about council, watch the meetings, go to a meeting once we can do that again. But also think about putting your hand up for the various advisory committees that councils often have, where there's opportunities for community participation.
Unmute. There we go. I don't know what just happened there. Fighting with my computer. Thanks for that, Kathryn. We have had a question from Mike about what councillors are paid, and this is always a bit of a vexed question in the media, which is going to be my last question to you. But what's the kind of pay range, Kathryn?
Oh, well, look, it depends on the size of the council. So in some smaller rural regional councils, it will be less than what it might be in one of the metro councils. So a councillor in a metro council probably earns around, or receives an allowance, I should say. It's not a salary so much, of around $30,000. The mayors receive a higher rate of allowance. In small rural regional areas, that does drop significantly in terms of the councillor allowance. And perhaps, Janet, you might have a better idea of what that looks like in some of those smaller areas.
Thank you, Kathryn. Our councillors get paid around $34,000 and the mayor is around $100,000. It is important, though, to recognise that this is an allowance, it is not a salary. There are occupational health and safety protections for councillors, but they are not employees in the normal sense of the word. but I think some councils would say have 10 or 15,000 for councils. It really does depend on capacity to pay.
We're reaching the end of our forum, but I want to ask a question that's quite dear to my heart. I work in the media, and I am really conscious of the scrutiny that councillors come under, not just obviously from, you know, the Ombudsman or from, you know, other bodies like that, but from the media being held to account in all manner of different ways, of course. But I'd like to hear your thoughts on how that has changed over time. Obviously, social media has changed a lot, and the streaming or the online streaming of council meetings has made a big difference to the ability for people to interact with council. Just when it comes to media, I might ask this of Judy, because obviously, you know, you've been in council and you've been the mayor, and the mayor is often the person who fronts up to the media when things need to be said. Janet, you too. But what is your sense of how councillors should approach media and should interact with the media? Judy?
Well, I think that the mayor is the spokesperson for the council, and I think it's very important that the council, through their code, respect that. You know, but also the mayor is a leader amongst equals. So they have a role to make sure that they're representing the views of their whole council. Prue, the media is interesting. You know, like sometimes you have an early morning call at 7 o'clock in the morning saying, did you realise such and such? And you've had no time to prepare for it, and you say, find some excuse to be able to find Janet Dore and say, well, what on earth's going on? You know, I've just been asked this question. Having said that, I think that the media should be a councillor's best friend. If you are proud of the work that you're doing, if you think I am doing the best that I can, I'm representing my community, I actually believe the role of the media is to explain the debate, to understand both sides of the story and to be able to report on both sides. When we see a headline that council voted such and such, and we don't understand the depth and the parameters around that debate, the community can be very easily swayed one way or the other. So I love the media, and I love them being in the chamber. I love to drip feed them and let them know what was coming along. And I love to get the response, because then there's no better feedback than actually hearing back from the media how you went. Mind you, social media really wasn't very active. And as I said at the start, I see now cowards actually paralysing people because of the debate. If you've got something to say, pick up the phone and speak to your councillor and give them the benefit of being able to respond to you.
Janet and Kathryn, just very lastly, do you advise councillors or people who are aspiring to be on council to really check their social media use and their own personal well-being, I guess?
Well, yes, the Code of Conduct does dictate that councillors should not do anything that would bring detriment to council, either reputational-wise or against council decisions. I don't look at social media. It would frankly do my head in. And it's not worth taking any serious note, because people, if they've got serious views and they want to make a point, they should use our general procedures. So yes, I think it's councillors have to comply with the Code of Conduct and have to represent council in cabinet solidarity, although that's not legislatively required. The Code of Conduct says you should abide by that decision once it's made. There's responsibilities and accountabilities on being a councillor.
Prue, if I could just add to that, of course, social media is here to stay, whether we like it or not. So if you are a councillor or a candidate using a social media platform, you do really need to be mindful of what might come at you, and put in place some support networks, of course, to protect yourself, even just if that's emotional support networks, when and if those I guess, trolls come in through the social media channel. And of course, we would advise you think very carefully before you would enter into any sort of debate or exchange with people on social media that really isn't going to be particularly constructive or helpful for anyone. In terms of the role of the media, I absolutely agree with Judy. It's such a critically important level of government that often, unfortunately, in the past, and we've seen some media representatives focus on matters that I think don't really reflect a true awareness of the scope and complexity of the business of local government, or even an understanding of the decision-making processes that that journalist might be commenting on. And what that does in turn then is confuse members of the community, those people who ultimately look to council for leadership and who are at times vulnerable. And I don't think that that's in the best interests of community members who really just want to understand the facts and also what are the role of these leaders in their community. We want people exercising informed votes in local government elections, not votes that might be based on fear or a lack of awareness of what they're actually voting for. And that's certainly, the VLGA's just conducted candidate information sessions across Victoria. We've had over 1,000 participants in those, and it was really around raising awareness of people who not only might be considering in standing for local government, but also who might just want to participate as a voter and do that in an informed way.
Well, hopefully we've gone some way to addressing some of those tonight. I mean, I know that it's such a huge space and we could probably go on for 6 more hours or so, but I will let you get on with your Friday nights. We'll wrap it there. Thank you very much to our guests, Judy, Verlin, Janet, Dore and Kathryn, Arndt, for spending their Friday evening with us. We very much appreciate your time and expertise, so thank you.
Thanks,
Thank
Prue.
you.
And please, if you're watching us on YouTube, please stay online for just a minute more as my wonderful fellow board member, Phil Roberts, is going to quickly give you some vital information.
Thanks very much, Prue. So I'd like to support Prue, first of all, in thanking our guests. Very informative and very valuable, all that information. We're very fortunate to have 3 experts in that way. So once again, I'd like to thank Judy, Janet and Kathryn for their input. I'd also like to thank Prue for her chairing. There's a lot of expertise there, and the panel went extremely well. Also to Sam, I'd like to thank him for his technical input and to making it work so well. So I just want to inform everyone, in the next 3 weeks, we're going to have the opportunity for each of the candidates in the 3 wards to present. So we're planning to have on the 18th September, next Friday, the North Ward candidates. On the 25th of September, the South Ward candidates, and on the 2nd of October, the Central Ward candidates. And the format will be much the same. We'll start at 5:30 p.m. and have either our President Mike or Prue as the chair of that. And the candidates will have some time to present their thoughts and also be able to answer some questions. The candidates will receive an email this coming Monday about that, and we invite them all to take part, and we hope that they all will. The other point I wanted to make is about the importance of the Mechanics Institute itself. We're doing this as a community service, and we want to encourage everyone that's with the forum to consider being a member of the Mechanics Institute. We're a non-for-profit organisation. We're often in the cultural heart of the city, and it's a big opportunity for us to have more membership and for people to be part of the Mechanics Institute. So thanks to everyone who took part today and listened in, and I think it's gone extremely well. So thank you once again. Bye for now. Hopefully that's finished.